Welcome to Twilight Fables, where the stories you thought you knew reveal their darker truths. Tonight, we sink beneath the waves into a tale of yearning, sacrifice, and a love that corrodes like salt on flesh. This is the Little Mermaid, the Salt Bride. Beneath the endless skin of the sea, there lived a girl who had never breathed the air of the world above. Her father's palace, carved from coral and jewelled with drifting pearls, lay deep within a forest of kelp that swayed like the arms of dreaming giants. Lanternfish and pale eels glided through the shadows, casting strange lights on its walls. The girl was the youngest of 6 sisters, each more radiant than the last, and yet she carried within her the deepest restlessness. Her sisters sang and played among the gardens of anemones, laughing with schools of silver fish, but the youngest one was always gazing upward, her eyes fixed on the faint shimmer where sea met sky. Her heart longed for what she had never known, the world above, with its changing winds and its strange, fleeting creatures who could not live beneath the waves. Her grandmother, who had seen many tides rise and fall, warned her gently, "The sea is your home, child. Do not look to the shore. There is no kindness for our kind upon the land." But the little mermaid's heart was a flame that water could not extinguish. Every story her sisters told of storms and shipwrecks only sharpened her hunger. Every shard of pottery or glint of glass that sank from human hands became a relic she treasured in her secret grotto. She imagined what it would be like to walk upon 2 limbs instead of 1 tail, to breathe air, to love someone whose heart beat fast like the wings of a trapped bird. It was on the night of her 15th year, when she was permitted at last to rise to the surface, that she first saw the prince. The sea was calm, the sky strewn with stars. She rose silently from the dark and saw a ship floating above, its lanterns gleaming like fireflies. Music drifted over the water, a sound so different from the songs of whales or sirens. On its deck, humans danced and drank, their voices carrying laughter into the night. Among them was one who stood apart, not for splendour of clothing or crown, but for the way he carried himself. Tall, proud, his eyes reflecting the firelight as though they held their own flame. The little mermaid watched him with a hunger that made her chest ache. In that moment, her heart bound itself to him, though he did not know she existed. Then the storm came. The sky split open, rain thrashing down, the ship lurching violently. The humans screamed as waves shattered the deck. The mermaid clung to the water's surface, watching helplessly as the prince was cast into the sea. She surged forward, her body cutting through the currents, reaching him before the waves could claim him. He was heavy in her arms, his breath stolen, his skin pale. She cradled his head against her shoulder as she swam, her long hair tangling with sea foam. She bore him to the shore, laying him gently upon the sand. As dawn broke over the horizon, he did not see her. His eyes opened only as another girl, a human maiden with hands soft as petals, bent over him. The little mermaid shrank back into the waves, watching as he smiled faintly at the one who found him, never knowing who had saved him. Her heart broke then, and for the first time she felt a strange sting upon her cheek. When she touched her face, her fingers came away, dusted with something sharp, white and glimmering, a salt crystal. It was small, no larger than a grain of sand, but it bit into her skin as though it wished to root there. She brushed it away, trembling, not yet understanding what had begun. From that day forward, her longing consumed her. She thought of the prince's face every waking moment, dreamed of his eyes each night. She imagined walking at his side, speaking with him, sharing a world where water could not follow. Her sisters noticed her silence, the way she floated listlessly among the kelp. They sang to her, brought her treasures, tried to coax her back into joy, but she only gazed upward, where the waves shimmered above like a barrier of glass. It was her grandmother who saw the change in her most clearly. One evening, as they sat among the glowing coral gardens, the old woman stroked her hair and said, "You are not the first of our kind to hunger for the land. Many have tried, child. None return unchanged." "What happens to them?" whispered the little mermaid. The grandmother's eyes darkened. "Some find their happiness for a time, others wither. The land does not love us as the sea does. It gives, but only to take away." The little mermaid pressed her lips together, her voice trembling. "But if I could have him, just for a little while, would it not be worth any cost?" The grandmother did not answer. That night, unable to resist her yearning, the little mermaid swam beyond the coral forests, past the trenches where even light dared not go, to a place whispered of in fear, the dwelling of the sea witch. The cave mouth yawned like a wound in the ocean floor. Its walls were lined with bones of creatures who had bartered more than they could afford. Strange plants with pale grasping tendrils swayed in the currents, brushing against her as she entered. At the heart of the cavern, the sea witch awaited. She was not monstrous, as tales claimed, but her beauty was unsettling. Her skin pale as driftwood, her hair long and black, her eyes like tide pools with no bottom. Around her floated jars of trapped voices, whispering faintly. "So," the witch said, her smile sharp as a fishbone. "Another dreamer, and what is it you crave, little one?" The mermaid bowed her head, trembling. "To walk on land, to live among humans, to win the love of a prince." The witch's laugh rippled through the water. "Love, a sweet word and a bitter one. And what will you pay for such a gift?" The mermaid hesitated. My voice, if you must take it, my song. The witch drifted closer, circling her. Your voice is precious, yes, but the transformation requires more. Every step you take on land will be as if upon knives, though you must smile through the pain, fail to win the prince's heart, and your body will dissolve into sea foam. The mermaid shivered, but whispered, I will bear it. The witch's smile widened. There is one more thing. She reached out and touched the mermaid's cheek, where the faint trace of a crystal still clung. Salt clings to you already. Each sorrow, each tear you shed will not pass away as water, but will harden upon your skin. If your grief becomes too great, you will become salt entirely, a statue, weeping forever. The mermaid's heart thudded, but she thought of the prince's eyes, of the life she had dreamed. Even so, she said, voice steady, I will do it. The witch cupped her face, almost tender. Then go, salt bride. She kissed her brow, and everything went black. When the little mermaid awoke, she was lying upon the sand. Her tail was gone, replaced by two pale, trembling legs. Each grain of sand beneath her felt like fire, each movement like glass biting into her flesh. She cried out, but no voice came, only silence. And when she looked down, she saw upon her hands the faint shimmer of salt, clinging like dust that would not wash away. The prince's castle rose on the cliffs above, and she smiled through the pain, her heart racing with fragile hope. She did not yet know that her dream was already beginning to wither. The little mermaid staggered as she rose, her legs shaking beneath her weight. The sea foamed at her heels, retreating as though it no longer claimed her. Each step pressed fire into her soles, sharp as if she were walking on broken shells. But she forced herself forward. The castle stood above, carved into the cliffs, with high windows that caught the morning sun. She could smell the air for the first time, thick with brine, flowers, and smoke from the torches that still smouldered from the night. Everything was overwhelming. The brightness of the sky, the cries of gulls, the harshness of wind against her bare skin. She stumbled across the beach until her knees buckled, salt tears welling in her eyes. When they fell, they did not dissolve into the sand. Instead, they hardened into small crystals that glittered before vanishing into her skin. She touched her cheek and felt the roughness forming, faint and sharp. The witch's warning echoed inside her. If your grief becomes too great, you will become salt entirely. But then she thought of the prince, and hope lifted her again. By chance, or perhaps by the sea witch's design, it was the prince himself who found her. He had ridden down to the beach with his guard, searching for the maiden he believed had saved him from the sea. His eyes fell upon the girl lying pale upon the sand, her hair tangled with foam, her lips parted in silence. "Who are you?" he asked, kneeling beside her. His voice was rich, warm, and she drank in the sound like air. She tried to answer, but no words came. Her throat ached with emptiness. Speechless, he smiled faintly, a mystery then. He offered his hand, and she took it, though pain shot through her feet as she rose. He steadied her, guiding her toward the path that led up the cliff. She limped, each step agony, but she kept her face serene, the way the witch had warned her to hide her suffering, to let love grow in its place. The prince glanced at her often, curious. "There is something about you," he said. "You remind me of someone, the one who saved me that night." But no, she was different. His brow furrowed, then smoothed. "No matter. Come, you are safe here." The castle was vast, its walls gleaming with banners, its halls filled with the echo of footsteps and laughter. Servants whispered as the prince led the strange girl inside, her silence making her seem otherworldly. They gave her garments, silks dyed in colours richer than any coral she had ever seen. They combed her hair, braided it with ribbons, placed shoes upon her feet. The shoes were soft, yet to her they felt like cages of knives. She bore it with a smile, though every step drew bloodless pain deeper into her bones. At meals she sat beside the prince, though she could not taste the food. Human fare turned to ash upon her tongue, and only the smell of salt water drifting from the sea stirred hunger in her. The prince spoke freely, filling the silence she left. He told her of his hunts, of his kingdom, of the bride his parents wished for him to take. She listened, her eyes fixed on him, her heart rising and breaking with every word. "You remind me of her," he said one evening, when the hall was quiet. "The girl I thought I saw when I awoke upon the shore. Her face lingers in my dreams, but it was another maiden who claimed to have pulled me from the waves. Perhaps I was mistaken." The little mermaid's chest tightened. She wanted to scream, to tell him it had been her, that she had borne him through the storm, but her voice was gone, her truth locked away. She smiled instead, and salt pricked at the corners of her eyes. Days turned into weeks. The mermaid danced for the prince, moving with grace, though every turn drove splinters of pain up her legs. He marvelled at her, praised her beauty, and yet always with a trace of distance, as though she were an ornament, a rare creature to be admired, but not fully understood. He showed her the kingdom, the gardens heavy with roses, the markets alive with noise and colour. Children pointed, whispering at the silent maiden who walked at the prince's side. She smiled at them, but inside her longing grew deeper. The sea called to her at night, the waves breaking on the cliffs, like a heartbeat she could not silence. Each time she stood at the window, gazing at the horizon, the salt spread further across her skin, faint crystals glistening along her arms, her collarbone like frost. She hid them beneath silks and jewels, but they scratched her flesh, cold and unyielding. One night, unable to bear it, she slipped from the castle and went down to the shore. She waded into the waves, letting the water wash over her feet, soothing the fire of her steps. For a moment, she felt whole again, as though the sea might claim her back. But the tide receded, leaving her alone, her legs trembling. She could never return. The witch's bargain had bound her. She sank to her knees and wept. This time her tears fell not into the sea, but onto her own hands, hardening into jagged crystals that cut her skin. She pressed her palms together, shuddering. From the shadows of the rocks, a voice whispered, "You feel it, don't you? The creeping hunger of salt." She turned, and there stood the sea witch, her dark hair dripping with brine, her eyes glittering with cruel amusement. "Did you think love would be enough to stop it?" the witch asked, stepping closer. The salt knows the truth. Each unspoken word, each wound of the heart, it feeds upon. Soon it will cover you, little bride. Soon you will stand frozen, beautiful and lifeless, as the waves laugh at your folly. The mermaid shook her head violently, her tears falling faster, only hastening the salt spread. She mouthed words, desperate, but no voice came. The witch leaned down, her breath cold. "Win him quickly, or be a monument to your own despair." Then she was gone, dissolved into the sea spray. When the mermaid returned to the castle, her body ached with the weight of silence and pain. She found the prince in the great hall, speaking with his advisors. His face lit up when he saw her, and he beckoned her close. "I have news," he said, his tone bright. "My parents have arranged for me to wed the princess of a neighbouring kingdom. It is an alliance that will strengthen us both. She is the maiden I thought saved me, the one I told you of. It seems fate has chosen her." The little mermaid froze, her heart splintering like glass. The salt spread across her chest, sharp and glittering. The prince touched her cheek gently. "Do not be sad. You will remain here, always my dearest friend. You are precious to me, more precious than words." But to her, his words were a blade. That night, as she lay sleepless, she felt the salt creeping higher, binding her ribs, tightening around her lungs. She thought of the sea, of her sisters' voices, of the freedom she had abandoned, and for the first time she wondered if love was not salvation but ruin. The days that followed passed in a haze of celebration. The prince's betrothal had been announced, and the castle swelled with guests. Musicians played, banners unfurled, and laughter echoed through the marble halls. The little mermaid moved among them like a ghost. She wore gowns of silk, her hair braided with pearls, her smile practiced and still. To the courtiers, she was a marvel, the prince's silent companion, strange and enchanting. They whispered of her beauty, her mystery, but none saw the sharp truth hidden beneath the veil of silk. Each step she took was agony. Each smile was drawn tight across a breaking heart. At night, alone in her chamber, she unwrapped the silks and jewels, staring at her reflection in the mirror. The salt spread further now, creeping like frost across glass. It glittered along her arms, her collarbone, across her cheek, where her tears had fallen. She pressed her fingers to it, and it cut her skin like knives. She remembered the sea witch's words, "Win him quickly, or be a monument to your own despair." But the prince's gaze belonged elsewhere. One evening, when the revelry had grown too loud, she slipped from the castle and made her way down to the cliffs. The night was heavy, the tide restless. She stood at the edge of the rocks, staring out at the sea, her chest king with longing. Then she heard it, voices rising from the water, haunting and familiar. "Sister," she gasped and stepped closer. There, emerging from the foam, were her 5 elder sisters. Their faces were pale, their hair tangled with seaweed, their eyes wide with sorrow. They reached for her with trembling hands. "You came too far," one whispered. "You should not have left," said another. Their voices wove together like the songs of whales, mournful and deep. The mermaid reached down, tears burning her eyes. She wanted to speak, to tell them everything, her love, her pain, her curse. But no voice came, only silence and salt. The eldest sister lifted a hand, holding something that glimmered in the moonlight. It was a knife, its blade carved from the spine of a sea serpent, sharp and glistening. "We gave her our hair," the sister said, her tone breaking. "Every lock, every strand. We begged the witch. She gave us this and told us it is the only way." The little mermaid stared, trembling. "If you drive it into his heart before dawn," the eldest whispered, "the spell will break. You will return to us, to the sea. The salt will not claim you. You will live." Her sisters' voices pleaded, echoing like the tide. "Come back, come back, come back." The mermaid clutched the knife, her hand shaking. It was cold, heavier than she expected, and it burned against her skin like truth. She looked at her sisters, their eyes glistening with grief, their hair shorn, their beauty dimmed for her sake. She wanted to throw herself into their arms, to return, to let the sea carry her once more. But then she thought of the prince, his smile, his hand upon her cheek, his voice calling her precious. She thought of the dream she had clung to, the vision of walking beside him. Her heart warred within her, tearing her in two. Her sisters wept as the tide pulled them back into the sea, their voices fading. "Choose, sister, choose." She stood on the cliff, the knife heavy in her hand, the salt creeping higher across her skin. That night, she walked silently into the prince's chamber. He slept peacefully, his chest rising and falling, his lips curved faintly as though he dreamed of love. She stood over him, the knife trembling in her hands. If you drive it into his heart, you will be free. If not, you will turn to salt before the sea reclaims you. Her tears fell, striking her hands, hardening into jagged crystals. They cut into her flesh, bloodless but sharp, and she stifled a cry. The prince stirred, his eyes opening. He saw her standing there, the knife gleaming in her hands, her body trembling. "Why?" he whispered, his voice heavy with sleep. "Why do you weep so, silent one?" She dropped the knife. It struck the stone floor, ringing like a bell. She fell to her knees, clutching her face, hiding the salt that spread across her skin. The prince reached for her, lifting her gently. "You are too strange for this world," he murmured. "Too beautiful, too sorrowful. You are not meant for pain." But his words cut deeper than any blade. He pitied her, nothing more. The following morning, the castle buzzed with excitement. The prince's bride-to-be had arrived, a princess with hair the colour of wheat and eyes bright as dawn. She was everything the kingdom admired, graceful, warm, and alive with laughter. The mermaid stood at the prince's side, her salt-stained body hidden beneath silks, her face a mask of serenity, but inside something cracked. She watched the way his eyes lit when he looked at the princess, the way his voice softened, the way his hand lingered upon hers. The mermaid knew then that she had lost. The salt spread faster now, branching across her skin like ice in winter, sharp and unyielding. She hid it as best she could, but each smile brought cracks, each laugh around her deepened the weight of silence. At night, she returned to her chamber, staring into the mirror as the salt climbed higher. Her reflection was a stranger, no longer flesh, no longer sea, but something caught in between. She thought of the knife, still hidden beneath her bed. She thought of the sea, of her sisters' voices calling her home. She thought of the prince, his love never hers to claim, and she wept, though every tear hastened her undoing. The night before the wedding, she stood once more upon the cliffs, the waves crashing below. The salt had reached her throat, her breath shallow, her body heavy. She lifted her face to the wind, her silent cry carried into the sea. For a moment, she thought she heard her sisters again, their voices on the tide, but it was only the sound of waves breaking against stone. She sank to her knees, clutching the knife, the salt glittering beneath the moonlight. Her choice was clear, yet impossible. The morning of the wedding dawned pale and brittle, the light slicing across the castle walls in thin cold beams. The halls had been scrubbed, polished, scented with flowers and incense, but the little mermaid noticed the faint grit left behind, almost like the memory of a storm. She moved through the corridors in her gown of blue silk, the fabric heavy and unfamiliar against legs that a year ago had only known fins. Every step made her knees ache, and beneath her feet the smooth marble chilled her bones. She forced a smile at passing servants, a thin, practiced curve of lips, but the salt beneath her skin prickled, rising in tiny crystals along her forearms and collarbone. The wedding was meant to be the pinnacle of her sacrifice, the crowning of her longing, but it felt more like a stage on which her failures were displayed. The courtiers whispered as she passed, the silent bride they called her, marvelling at her beauty while ignoring the ache in her posture, the tremor in her hands. Her hair, dark and heavy with pearls, gleamed under the chandeliers, but strands caught at the crystalline salt creeping along her shoulders. She pressed her hands against her chest, but the crystals dug deeper into her flesh, burning like frostbite. No one noticed. No one ever noticed. The prince, for all his charm, was already distant. He nodded politely, complimented her appearance, and told jokes to guests, while she followed silently, a ghost in silk. He had been tender in private once, before the wedding, and she had believed it could be love. But now, standing at the altar, she realized how carefully his tenderness had been measured. It had been a gift, yes, but only as long as it suited him. Love, she learned in that moment, could be conditional. The ceremony was a blur of vows and incense, of polished words, spoken with the precision of trained mouths. When the priest's voice rolled over the gathered crowd, it sounded strange to her ears, alien as the hush of the deep sea. She had expected devotion, warmth, perhaps even a kind of miraculous joy. Instead, it was formality, spectacle, and the faint odour of roses suffocating her senses. She swallowed hard, wishing for water, wishing for the comfort of ocean depths. When the prince turned to her with the pretense of warmth, she noticed for the first time the faint impatience in his expression. His hand brushed hers in a courteous, almost mechanical gesture. He was polite, careful not to crush her fingers, and yet she understood in that moment that she had been more of a decoration than a companion. She swallowed the lump in her throat, willing the tears to stay hidden, but a few fell nonetheless. The salt hardened instantly where they struck her cheeks, cutting into her skin with an icy sting. The guests clapped as the ceremony ended, the sound rolling over her like waves. She forced herself to smile, even as her teeth ground against the sharp edges of salt beneath her skin. A few courtiers noticed the glitter in her hair and whispered that it was merely jewellery, but the Little Mermaid knew the truth. She was crystallizing from within. Every heartbeat seemed to crystallize a fraction more of her, and every breath made the ache of longing more acute. The banquet hall had been decorated with banners of gold and sapphire, and the long table groaned under the weight of delicacies. Roast meat nuts glistened in their juices, breads steamed with fragrant salt, and casks of wine glimmered in the torchlight. The little mermaid sat beside the prince, who regaled guests with stories of his travels and trade deals, his laughter warm but distant. She could not bring herself to speak, even if she had found her voice, for she knew it would be swallowed by the grandeur of the room. Her eyes scanned the crowd, smiling faces, polite nods, shallow eyes. None of them knew the sea. None of them understood the price she had paid. Her arms ached under the weight of her gown. Her legs trembled with fatigue. The salt was no longer confined to her wrists or shoulders. It climbed across her torso, tracing the lines of her ribs, spreading toward her heart. She pressed her palms to it, but it was no use. The crystals were embedded now, entwined with her flesh. Pain pulsed in rhythm with her heartbeat, and still she smiled. Still she endured the polite questions and the cheers. As the evening wore on, the prince grew distracted by the attentions of other guests. He laughed at the right moments, nodded at the right gestures, but the warmth that had once shone in his eyes had dimmed to practicality. The little mermaid felt a sharp, twisting grief. She had believed in a love that would make life on land worth the sacrifice. Now she understood that the life she had chosen was not hers to command. It was a gilded cage, and she was the prisoner. During the final toast, the prince raised his glass to the queen, the court, and the union they had forged, his eyes only briefly meeting hers. She tried to catch a flicker of emotion, some sign that he felt the weight of her presence, but there was nothing. She realized then that his affection had always been surface deep, as delicate and fleeting as foam on a wave. It had never been enough. The banquet ended, but the day's ordeal had left her exhausted. She retreated to her chamber, under the pretense of rest, moving slowly, each step a protest from her stiffening legs. The salt crystals along her arms and shoulders glittered in the candlelight, sharp as splinters, and the weight in her chest pressed down like a stone. She sank to the floor, drawing her knees to her chest, and for the first time allowed herself to weep openly. Each tear was another crystal, cutting into her skin as it fell. Night brought no relief. The castle was silent, except for the occasional murmur of a guard or the soft tapping of wind against the windows. She pressed her face to the cool marble of the floor, listening to her own ragged breathing. The salt had reached her throat now, making each breath a labour. She thought of the sea, of the cool, dark water that had once been home, and she longed to return. She thought of her sisters, of their voices rising above the waves, calling her back, and she ached to hear them again. Yet she could not move. The prince's wedding had bound her here, and the salt bound her body. The weight of her sacrifice was absolute. She felt her limbs stiffen as if sculpted from the crystals forming beneath her skin. Every muscle ached, every nerve burned. She pressed her hands to her face, trying to hide the growing frost of salt, but it glittered through her fingers, irremovable. In the mirror, she saw herself as others would see her, beautiful, statuesque, untouchable. But in that reflection, she also saw the truth. Her beauty was a cage, her silence a prison, and the life she had dreamed of was already gone. She was neither sea nor land, neither alive nor free. She was a monument, and the world would admire her without ever understanding the depths of her sorrow. She collapsed onto her bed, the knife she had kept hidden still tucked beneath the mattress. She reached for it, trembling, but could not bring herself to act. The thought of harming the prince, even for freedom, repulsed her. She could not turn to violence, not even for herself. And so she lay there, salt creeping over her body, turning her slowly into something else, a creature of crystal and grief, beautiful and doomed. Outside, the moonlight glimmered off the waves, as if the sea itself mourned her decision. The wind carried the sound of water against the cliffs, a soft, endless song that promised both release and loss. The little mermaid closed her eyes, letting the salt press deeper into her flesh, knowing that her life on land, however gilded, was not the happiness she had imagined. She was trapped between worlds, a bride of salt and sorrow, and the future stretched before her as unyielding as stone. She was the silent bride, the salt bride, and the true cost of love on land was only beginning to reveal itself. The first days of marriage should have been golden, yet for the little mermaid they were leaden and cold. The prince rose early each morning, dressing in fine tunics and perfumed oils, his time consumed by councils, hunts, and public appearances. The little mermaid followed when summoned, sat at his side when demanded, and withdrew when dismissed. She had thought their life together would be shared, his secrets whispered in her ear, his hand always reaching for hers, his gaze softened by devotion. Instead, she found herself waiting in silken chambers, her only company the murmur of servants who rarely spoke to her except to dress her or guide her from one room to another. When the prince returned from hunts, he was flushed with triumph, boasting of the deer he had felled or the boar that had fallen beneath his spear. He laughed as his companions praised his strength and skill, while she sat quietly, her eyes on the floor. He never asked her about her day, never asked what she thought, and even if he had, she had no voice left to answer. At first, she tried to believe this was only the way of marriage on land, that silence, distance, and duty were the natural order, but each night When she lay awake staring at the vaulted ceiling, she felt the ache of loss grow sharper. She had given everything for him, and in return she had been made into an ornament, a jewel polished for display, admired but untouched. The salt spread faster now. It formed along her collarbone in ridges like white coral. Her wrists stiffened with crystalline cuffs. Her tears etched lines of jagged frost down her cheeks. Servants noticed. At first, they whispered about the strange powder that clung to her skin, the way her gowns sometimes tore where crystals had burst through. Some pitied her, believing it to be a wasting illness. Others recoiled, afraid to touch her, lest the affliction spread. More than once, she entered a room to find conversation abruptly stilled, eyes darting away, as though her presence shamed them. When she walked through the halls, children stared openly. One pointed and cried, "She shines like broken glass," before being hurried away by a nursemaid. The prince dismissed it all with a wave of his hand. "She is delicate," he told them. "She comes from a strange place beneath the sea. Her body is different, that is all." But his tone carried more irritation than compassion. He did not like to be questioned. He did not like to be pitied. And she, his silent bride, became more and more a burden in his eyes. One evening, during a feast, the salt betrayed her in a way she could no longer conceal. The hall was filled with nobles, laughter ringing off the marble walls. The prince sat at the head of the table, drinking deeply, his voice rich with stories of the hunt. The mermaid sat beside him, her hands folded in her lap, her plate untouched. A courtier leaned close, curiosity bright in her eyes. "Your Grace," she said sweetly, "is it true you cannot speak, that your kind beneath the sea has no words?" The mermaid looked down, tears stinging her eyes. She shook her head slightly, trying to show the truth without words, but the woman only laughed, her voice cruel. "Perhaps that is why the prince favours you," she said. "A wife who cannot contradict him. What man would not dream of such a blessing?" The table erupted in laughter. The prince chuckled too, though he raised his hand as if to soften the sting. "Enough," he said, still smiling. "She is sensitive. Do not tease her so." But the damage had been done. The mermaid felt the burn of shame, her tears spilling silently. The salt spread instantly across her arms and face, glittering under the torchlight. Gasps rose around the table. "She is crystallizing," someone whispered. The mermaid fled before the stairs became too sharp, her gown tearing as crystals burst through the fabric. She ran through the corridors, her bare feet leaving faint traces of salt on the polished stone. She locked herself in her chamber and collapsed against the mirror. Her reflection was almost unrecognizable. Salt crusted her face, her neck, her arms, spreading in jagged white blossoms. Her eyes seemed sunken, shadowed by sorrow, her lips cracked and pale. She looked less like a bride, more like a corpse, pulled from the sea. She pressed her palms against the glass, and the salt cut her skin, leaving hairline cracks on the mirror's surface. For the first time, she saw what she was becoming, not simply cursed, not merely ill, but transformed into something otherworldly, a monument of salt and grief, a statue that could not move, could not speak, could not weep without hardening further. She imagined herself one day standing on the cliffs, her body entirely crystallized, the wind whistling through her hollow chest, while the waves broke at her feet. People would point to her from the shore and tell stories. The prince's silent bride, the woman of salt, the one who loved too deeply and lost herself. Her heart pounded. She stumbled to the bed, reached beneath it, and pulled forth the knife her sisters had given her. Its blade gleamed faintly in the candlelight, sharper than her sorrow, heavier than her grief. She raised it, pressing the point against her chest, but her hands trembled violently. She thought of the prince, his smile, his indifference, his warmth once given and now withheld. She thought of the sea, its embrace, its darkness, its endless call. Her tears fell one by one, each turning to salt before striking the blade, and she understood then the knife was not her escape, not yet. She lowered it, hiding it away once more. Days passed. The prince grew more distant still. He no longer looked at her with wonder, only with faint irritation, as though she were a fragile vase placed too close to the edge of a table. He spent his nights elsewhere, sometimes in his study, sometimes in the company of courtiers, sometimes, she suspected, in the arms of others. She lay awake alone, her body stiffening, her breath shallow. The salt crept higher, binding her ribs, pressing against her heart. She dreamed of the sea, of voices singing from below, of her sister's hair floating like dark banners in the water. The dreams began to blur into waking hours. Sometimes, as she walked through the gardens, she heard the ocean whisper her name. Sometimes, as she bathed, she thought she saw salt water welling from her pores instead of sweat. Sometimes, when she touched her cheek, she felt not skin, but stone. She was unravelling, and worse, she was beginning to believe she would not survive the unravelling. The palace had many windows that opened to the sea. Once, the Little Mermaid had found comfort in them. She would stand at the casements, staring at the restless tide, listening for the faint echo of songs carried on the wind. It was her only solace in those first bleak weeks. Now, she could scarcely look without trembling, for each time she gazed upon the waves, she heard the sea call her name, not gently as before, but insistently, a voice woven from countless currents. Come back, you do not belong here. At first she resisted, pressing her hands over her ears, But the sound did not leave. It whispered through the corridors, slipped into her dreams, thrummed beneath her skin. The salt itself seemed to answer it, stretching, blossoming, hardening faster each time the ocean's pull reached her. Within a month of the wedding, the curse could no longer be disguised. Salt crept across her face in ridges like shattered porcelain. Her hair, once flowing like strands of midnight, had dulled, stiffened, streaked with pale threads that clinked faintly when she moved. Her fingers bent stiffly, encased in crystalline growths that cracked and flaked with each gesture. The palace servants avoided her. Some crossed themselves when she passed. Others whispered prayers. A few knelt outright, believing she was some omen from the deep, a saint or a monster depending on their fear. In the great hall, tapestries had once depicted the prince's victories, his hunts, his parades, his triumphs in battle. Now, the courtiers whispered new stories, weaving her into them. The silent bride, the woman of salt, the ocean's curse. Children peered at her from behind pillars, daring one another to touch the crystals that grew along her skirts. When one boy reached too close, brushing the salt that jutted from her sleeve, he yelped as if burned. His nurse snatched him away, scolding, though the boy swore his skin still stung where he had touched her. The prince's patience grew thin. "She frightens them," he said one evening, pacing before the hearth. His voice was sharp, wine-glossed with irritation. Every banquet turns into a spectacle. Every court session dissolves into murmurs. I married you for grace, for beauty, for mystery, yet look at you now. He gestured at her, his hand cutting through the air like a blade. She sat silently, her crystalline fingers clutched tight in her lap. You cannot speak. You cannot charm. You cannot even walk across the room without leaving a trail of dust. What use are you to me now? His words struck harder than any knife. She had no voice to defend herself, no way to remind him of what she had sacrificed. She lowered her eyes, salt tears streaking her cheeks, and the crystals spread further with every drop. He turned away, disgust plain on his face. At least make yourself scarce, he muttered. If you cannot be my jewel, then do not be my shame. From then on, he no longer summoned her to feasts. She was left alone in her chambers, visited only by servants, who brought food she could scarcely eat. Salt coated her tongue, until even water tasted like brine. Bread crumbled to ash in her mouth. Only when she pressed her lips to the basin and drank greedily of plain water did she feel momentary relief, though it too soon turned to salt upon her tongue. Nights grew longer, the sea's voice louder. She began to dream of her sisters, not as she had left them, but changed. Their faces were pale as moonlight, their hair heavy with barnacles, their eyes wide with hunger. They swam around her in circles, their mouths opening and closing soundlessly. When she reached for them, their fingers dissolved into streams of salt that clung to her skin. She would wake in terror, clutching her chest, the sheets stiff with crystals that had poured from her body while she slept. The courtiers grew bolder in their cruelty. Some laughed openly when she passed, tossing handfuls of salt on the floor as mockery. Others avoided her entirely, making signs of warding as though she were plague. One day, when she entered the chapel, the priest refused to bless her, muttering that the sea had already claimed her soul. The Little Mermaid withdrew further until her only company was the whisper of waves beyond the window. She pressed her face to the glass, her salt-rimmed breath fogging the pain, and longed to fling herself into the waters below. But the knife beneath her bed still waited, a promise, a warning. She told herself she was strong enough to endure. She told herself the prince would remember his love. She told herself the sea could not truly have her if she resisted. Yet with each passing day, her body betrayed her more. The salt spread into her chest, making each breath ache. Her legs grew stiff, the joints cracking when she walked. Her hair fell in brittle strands that shattered when pulled. When she wept, her tears hardened before they fell, clinging to her lashes until she could scarcely open her eyes. One morning, she rose and found she could not unclench her hands. The salt had fused her fingers together, curling them into claws. She beat them against the wall in desperation until shards fell away, but the damage was done. Her hands were no longer her own. She staggered to the mirror. A stranger stared back, half woman, half statue. Her once luminous skin had dulled to grey-white stone, fissured with glittering veins. Her lips were cracked, her eyes rimmed with crystalline frost. She looked less alive than carved, and behind her reflection, faint but unmistakable, she thought she saw the ocean, and not the courtyard, not the chamber, the ocean itself. Dark waters pressed against the glass, fish darting through her reflection, weeds swaying in unseen currents. The voice rose louder, filling the chamber with its pull. Come back, you are ours, you were never theirs. Come back. The Little Mermaid sank to her knees, clutching her chest as the salt pressed tight against her heart. Her voice was gone, her body breaking, her love fading into cruelty. She realized then, with chilling clarity, that the sea would not wait forever. Soon, she would either return to it or become nothing but salt on the shore. The day came when the prince stopped speaking to her altogether. He did not summon her for meals, did not glance toward her chambers, did not even acknowledge her presence when their paths crossed in the palace halls. She became a shadow in her own home, reduced to a silent shape, drifting from room to room, and still the salt spread. By now, her arms were sheathed in brittle, glittering scales. Her legs cracked with every step, leaving pale dust scattered in her wake. The servants began following her with brushes and cloths, sweeping the residue from the floors as if she were an untidy guest who could not keep herself clean. They did not meet her eyes. One afternoon, she entered the great hall to find an unsettling sight. There, at the prince's command, artisans were constructing a dais in the corner, a platform draped in dark velvet, surrounded by ropes of gold. Atop it stood an empty pedestal of polished stone. The prince turned as she entered, his expression cool, calculating. "It is said salt preserves," he remarked to the assembled courtiers. "If her condition worsens, it would be a shame to waste such beauty. She might yet serve the kingdom, if not as a wife, then as a monument." Laughter rippled through the hall. Her knees weakened. She realized what he meant. He intended to display her like a relic, a curiosity, an ornament to be gazed upon long after her voice and flesh were gone, a jewel of salt to impress his guests. The courtiers crowded closer, murmuring suggestions about placement, lighting, the best vantage from which to view her eventual crystallization. No one asked her opinion. No one even acknowledged that she might still hear, still feel, still suffer. She fled before the tears could fall. That night, she dreamt again of her sisters, but this time, their faces were not sorrowful. They were triumphant, their hair whipped around them like banners, their teeth sharp as coral. They beckoned to her, hands outstretched, their voices like a storm. "Come back, leave the knife, the sea will claim you, the sea will make you whole." When she woke, her sheets were soaked in brine, her body slick with salt. She rose unsteadily, dragging herself to the window. The tide was high, the moon bright upon the waves. For a moment she thought she saw figures below, shapes that darted just beyond sight, pale arms breaking the surface before vanishing again. She pressed her hands to the glass, trembling. The sea was closer than ever. The palace began to shrink around her. She stopped venturing into the corridors, for every whisper cut her like a blade. The courtiers spoke of her openly now, wagering how long before she was fully transformed. Some said weeks, some days. One claimed she would not last the night. The servants no longer brought food to her chamber. Instead, they left bowls of water outside her door, as if she were an animal too dangerous to face. She drank desperately, though the liquid turned to brine on her tongue, never quenching her thirst. In the mirror, her reflection became less her own. Her eyes glittered like facets of quartz. Her lips stiffened into pale ridges. Her breath came ragged, echoing in her chest as though she were hollowing out from within. When she spoke to herself, though no sound left her throat, she imagined she could hear it echo faintly in the glass. A ghost voice, a memory of speech. She began to wonder if she was truly alive, or if she had already crossed into some half-death, her body merely lingering until the final salt claimed her. One evening, she gathered the courage to approach the prince once more. She found him in the gardens, speaking with a noble woman whose laugh was as light as falling petals. His hand rested on the woman's arm, his smile easy, his voice low. The mermaid stood at the edge of the path, salt scattering around her feet like frost. The noble woman's eyes widened at the sight of her, and she whispered something into the prince's ear. He turned, his expression tightening. "Go back inside," he said sharply, waving her away as though she were a servant who had overstepped her bounds. "You shame yourself like this." She reached toward him, her crystalline fingers trembling, trying to remind him of the vows they had made, of the love she had once believed in, but he did not soften. "You were a dream," he said coldly, "but dreams fade. You are not the woman I married. You are something else entirely." The words struck her harder than any blow. She staggered back, her body cracking, her chest aching. The noblewoman laughed softly, and the prince turned his back to her, resuming his conversation as though she were already gone. The little mermaid fled to her chamber, her vision blurred with tears that turned to salt before they fell. She collapsed upon the floor, her breath rasping, the knife gleaming faintly from beneath the bed. For hours she lay beside it, her hand hovering just above the hilt. The sea called to her from beyond the walls, louder now, insistent. The knife waited, sharp and final. Two paths, two endings. Neither promised joy, but one promised silence, and the other, perhaps, promised home. The bells of the palace tolled through the heavy morning air, their clangor shaking the glass in the high windows. The little mermaid stirred from the edge of sleep, her body creaking like old wood. She felt each vibration, not as sound, but as cracks spreading deeper through her crystallizing frame. Her arms resisted movement. Her fingers had fused into white ridges, claw-like and stiff. Even her breath whistled against salt, lodged in her throat. The knife still rested beside her on the bed, cold and gleaming faintly in the weak dawn light. It had lain there many nights, whispering its promise, "End it quickly, before the sea or the salt swallows you whole." But this morning she could not even grasp it. Her hands, bound in jagged cuffs of salt, would not bend enough to close around the hilt. The choice was leaving her, or perhaps, she thought, the choice had never been hers to make at all. The palace was alive with activity long before she dragged herself from her chamber. The great hall rang with hammers and voices, workers arranging the dais where her pedestal stood. Fine draperies were hung from the rafters, silks embroidered with silver threads, so they glittered like waves. Candles were placed in tall golden holders to catch the crystals that would, one day soon, grow across her body. The prince walked among them, his expression one of satisfaction. "Higher," he commanded to one servant, struggling with the velvet canopy. The light must fall cleanly across her. She must be seen from every angle. Courtiers surrounded him, nodding, murmuring approval. Some suggested a plaque to mark her sacrifice. Others whispered that her preservation would be a miracle to inspire the realm, but all spoke of her as though she were no longer alive, no longer flesh. They anticipated her stillness, her silence, as one might anticipate the unveiling of a statue or the dedication of a shrine. The little mermaid lingered at the edge of the hall, unseen, her heart breaking as she listened. They did not see her. They saw only the monument she would become. When she turned away, tears cracked into crystals on her cheeks. She left a trail of glittering salt behind her, and the servants swept it up without a glance. Her chamber became a tomb. The windows overlooked the cliffs, and the sea's voice poured through them without cease. By day, it whispered, pulling at her thoughts until she felt her mind unravel. By night, it roared, filling her dreams with visions of her sisters swimming in circles around her, their mouths open wide in silent calls. Sometimes she thought she saw her grandmother's face among them, stern and sorrowful, shaking her head. Other times she thought she saw herself, already hardened into stone, standing on the sea floor, while fishes swam through her hollow chest. The salt wasted no time now. It grew thick across her ribs, binding them. Her movements became jerky, halting, like a marionette of glass. Her voice had long since vanished, but now even the breath she forced from her lungs whistled dry and cracked. She could not eat. She could barely drink. She spent hours hunched at the basin, scooping water into her mouth, only for it to crystallize against her lips. The servants no longer entered. They left bowls at her door, as if feeding a beast. Sometimes she heard them whisper to one another, "How much longer? The prince says weeks, but I think days. When she breaks, will she shatter?" Their words were not cruel, not exactly, but they stripped her of humanity, all the same, and still she endured. That night, the prince came to her chamber. She rose as best she could when he entered, her salt-crusted knees grinding. He stood in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the torchlight in the hall. For a moment, she thought he had come to her at last, in tenderness, that he would sit beside her as he once had, take her hand and remember the love she had given everything for. But his eyes were cold, and his lips pressed into a line. "You should remain in your chamber from now on," he said. "The hall is ready. The courtiers expect the unveiling soon. Until then, you must preserve yourself. The salt, it is delicate. I won't have you stumbling in corridors, crumbling before your time." She reached for him, desperate to plead, though her voice was gone. Her crystalline fingers stretched toward his arm, the sharp edges cutting the air between them. He stepped back quickly, his gaze flashing with distaste. "You were my jewel," he said, almost bitterly, "but jewels must be flawless to hold their worth. You are something else now." He turned and left before her tears could fall. She collapsed where she stood, her body ringing faintly as the salt cracked under the force of her grief. The night stretched endlessly. The sea outside her window rose to a fury, waves clawing the cliffs as though they would tear them down. She could not sleep. She lay curled upon her bed, the knife before her. She stared at it for hours. At times she reached for it, fighting to bend her stiffened hands enough to grasp it. But each time she tried, her fingers locked, crystals grinding. The knife mocked her, gleaming in silence. Visions swept through her. She saw herself carried to the dais, the prince standing proudly at her side as courtiers bowed before her crystallized body. She heard the whispers, the silent bride, the monument of salt, the jewel of the kingdom. She felt the children pointing, laughing, mocking. She felt herself eroding, grain by grain, until nothing remained but dust swept into the corners. Then the vision shifted, and she saw the sea, vast, eternal, its arms stretched wide. Her sisters swam at its edge, their pale hands reaching for her. Come back, come home. The sea forgives. The sea takes all things into itself. Between them lay the knife, sharp and final. But she knew now the truth. The knife was not hers to wield. It was a human's end, and she was no longer wholly human. The sea had called her since the moment she left it, and it would not be denied. The first light of dawn painted the waves silver. She rose, though every step cracked her body further. Salt fell from her like snow, littering the floor. She opened her chamber door for the last time, staggering into the hall. No servants stirred, no courtiers blocked her path. It was as if the palace itself slept through her leaving. She walked slowly, each movement a battle, her body crumbling behind her. She passed through the empty great hall, the pedestal looming at its centre, waiting for her. She paused, her salt-stiffened head turning toward it. A shiver passed through her, not of fear, but of defiance. She would not be their relic. The doors to the courtyard loomed ahead. She pushed them open, the hinges groaning. Cold air rushed against her, sharp as knives, but she welcomed it. She staggered across the stones, each footstep leaving white trails behind her, until at last she reached the cliffs. The sea raged below, waves exploding against the rocks, spray reaching her face. The salt on her cheeks mingled with the brine until she could no longer tell one from the other. And there, rising from the foam, were her sisters. Their faces were luminous, their eyes wide, their voices filling her mind. Come back, leave this place. The land does not want you. The sea waits, the sea forgives. She stretched her arms toward them, her body cracked wide, salt spilling from her ribs, her skin splitting with the movement. She could no longer stand. She fell forward, into the wind, into the roar, into the sea that had claimed her from the start. The ocean closed around her like a mother's arms. The salt shell that bound her hissed and broke, shards dissolving into the endless brine. Pain gave way to release. Her lungs filled not with air, but with water that felt like breath. Her hair unfurled, dark and endless, no longer brittle, but fluid once more. Her sisters surrounded her, their arms enfolding her, their voices a song. She dissolved, piece by piece, until she was no longer woman, no longer bride, no longer broken jewel. She became water, foam, tide. She became voice without sound, memory without end. She was the sea, and above the palace awoke. The prince stood in the hall, staring at the empty pedestal. He sent men to search, but they found nothing, no body, no salt, no trace, only the waves below, crashing endlessly, whispering against the cliffs. The courtiers whispered that the silent bride had returned to the depths. Some said she had cursed the prince, that the sea would never again be kind to his ships. Others said she had been claimed as a bride by the ocean itself. The prince never spoke of her again, but at night, when the tide was high and the waves battered his windows, he thought he heard her voice in the roar, not words, for she had none, but a sound of weeping that did not cease. The sea does not forget, and neither does the salt.